During this time, the war in Ukraine began to turn into a war of attrition, which is generally more favorable for Russia, as it has much greater resources. For its part, old conflicts in the world have begun to flare up, such as the one in Israel. The United States also plays a crucial role there. Under these circumstances, the question arises, what will happen if Ukraine loses this war? How will the world and Ukraine itself change? It is worth noting that Ukraine's loss in this war can be interpreted differently and can occur in a number of scenarios. Some will consider the preservation of the status quo without returning the territories a loss, while others will consider the continuation of an endless war. And we can also consider the option of a second attempt at a large-scale Russian offensive on Kyiv, with a successful outcome for Russia and a fatal outcome for Ukraine. In this video, we will take a global look at what happens in the worst-case scenario if Ukraine loses this war. The first consequence is the strengthening of Russia in the post-Soviet space and the threat of new conflicts. Obviously, if Russia wins this war, it will be able to strengthen its role in the post-Soviet space. Since the early 1990s, Russia's role in the post-Soviet space has been extremely high. Russia is the main and largest country in the Union, so it had a serious influence on literally every country in the former Soviet republics. This affected both the economic and the socio-political spheres. Russia had a serious reserve of soft power. In many countries, including Ukraine, Russia began to lose its influence in the noughties. The Baltic states joined the EU and NATO, and Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova also began to change their vector to the west. In the 2010s, Russia's position weakened even more. Central Asia leans toward China, Azerbaijan toward Turkey, and the aforementioned countries drift even further to the west. However, a victory in Ukraine could strengthen Russia's regional influence. Many countries will simply fear a similar scenario to that in Ukraine and will therefore follow the Kremlin's lead. In such a situation, Moscow will, of course, put pressure on countries and blackmail them. In the worst-case scenario, new wars will begin in which Russia will be able to win. It should be understood that Ukraine is one of the largest post-Soviet countries, so winning over others will be much less of a problem. Globally, the United States could thus lose its weight in the post-Soviet space, which would weaken Europe and the NATO bloc, and Russia would satisfy its expansionist appetites when its sphere of influence at least includes a significant number of former Soviet republics. The second is the issue of Taiwan and China. The issue of Taiwan, as you know, has recently become more and more heated. The Chinese authorities are quite determined. In turn, American generals are already predicting and preparing for war in the next 5 to 10 years. Putin's success in Ukraine may show China that it can do the same with Taiwan. Moreover, China, having already observed the war in Ukraine, takes into account the mistakes made by both sides and understands how the great wars of the new generation are fought. Of course, an offensive against Taiwan would be different due to the geography of the region, but China could gain useful experience here as well. In addition, the Russian side, with its extensive experience in long and large-scale combat operations, can help China, and, for example, through instructors, it can share its experience and even train Chinese soldiers. In general, a loss in Ukraine could weaken the United States' position in Asia. This could affect both China, with its claims not only to Taiwan but also to islands in the South China Sea and the Korean Peninsula, with Kim Jong-un's ambitions to conquer the whole of Korea. Since North Korea has been actively cooperating with Russia, if it wins, it may be rewarded for its help in the form of new technologies that North Korea obviously does not have at the moment. In general, a war in Taiwan could happen even earlier, before the war in Ukraine is over, and vice versa, it could cause Ukraine's defeat. If a war breaks out in Taiwan, the United States will redirect all its efforts to defend the island, and Ukraine may not be a priority for supplies and resources. Despite Biden's claim that there will be enough resources for everyone, this is not the case. The United States has a number of bottlenecks in military production. For example, even Ukraine lacks 155mm shells, and they will be actively needed in Taiwan. This may cause problems. The United States may be able to find a way to quickly ramp up production if necessary, but the risks for Ukraine will remain high. The third consequence is the possible weakening of NATO and Europe as a whole. At the moment, it is difficult to estimate the real probability of such an event, but it is quite possible. On the one hand, the war in Ukraine may not change NATO's position globally. On the contrary, the war has caused the NATO bloc to expand once again to include Finland, with Sweden expected to join soon. On the other hand, the above-mentioned risks will weaken the United States, and with it the entire pro-American bloc, including NATO. European countries will not be able to feel as secure in the future if Russia increases its power in the region. Biden himself has said that if Ukraine loses, Putin will be able to attack the Baltic states and even Poland. Again, this is probably just populism and political manipulation. However, one way or another, a Russian victory in Ukraine will definitely not help the bloc and will put it in a more vulnerable position. The fourth consequence is global problems in Ukraine. If Russia wins a complete victory over Ukraine, i.e., controls all or most of the Ukrainian lands, we can expect massive repressions and the erasure of Ukrainian identity. This is already happening in the occupied territories to some extent, but it will spread to the rest of Ukraine. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, some may consider the endless war on the territory to be Ukraine's loss. Indeed, it could simply destroy Ukrainian statehood. If the war drags on, the country's economy will be destroyed, the population will leave the region en masse, and Ukraine itself will simply turn into a disaster region. In general, under this scenario, Putin will achieve his goal of somehow pushing Ukraine to the brink of survival and turning it into a European Afghanistan, a zone of constant disaster with no prospects and constant war. Such a scenario would obviously also be a loser for Ukraine and lead to irreversible consequences. Returning to international politics, we cannot but mention the Middle East region, which has recently become extremely hot again because of the war in Israel. If Ukraine is defeated, Iran's position in the region could be significantly strengthened, and then the country could directly participate in the war against Israel, which Iran has been trying to destroy for decades. Iran today is a strategically important ally of Russia, and in return it is already receiving Russian technology, such as new aircraft. If Russia wins, Iran will gain an advantage in the region both at the expense of its military industry, which has been growing recently in mass-producing drones for Russia, and at the expense of Russia itself, which will help Iran and through it strengthen its position in the region. Moreover, Russia will be able to return to Syria again, but with more serious forces after the war in Ukraine is over. This will strengthen the Assad regime and help in Iran's confrontation with Israel. If Russia wins, it could force many countries in the Middle East and beyond to rethink their policies toward the West and join Russia. Indeed, in many regions, there will be many such countries, even some of the allies of the United States in the Middle East. Globally, we can say that the global security system may indeed collapse. To summarize, Ukraine's loss in this war could play a serious role at the global level. The United States will lose its role in world politics, Russia will strengthen its regional influence, and new tensions will likely arise in other parts of the world, and the United States will not be able to do anything about it. This is primarily about Taiwan's war with China and the global escalation in the Middle East. However, in this case, the most pessimistic scenario in this regard was considered. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel to not miss new videos.
I never answer to no, man, I still go.